A family in Moscow lies awake in the early hours of a morning in 1937, listening for a sound from the street below. What they are listening for is a car engine, running the way it runs when the NKVD has stopped outside a building in the night. They know what it means when it stops. The question, for every family in every apartment above them, is whether it stops outside theirs. Lenin dies on the 21st of January 1924, 13 years before the family in that Moscow apartment learns to lie awake listening. What follows is not an orderly succession. It is a scramble among men who have spent their entire careers defining themselves against orderly succession. Revolutionaries who built a movement on the conviction that history belongs to whoever seizes it, now needing to decide who gets to seize the party. The mechanism they do not have is a clear line of inheritance. The mechanism they do have is a general secretary. The general secretary's job when Stalin takes it in 1922 is paperwork and administration. The party's intellectuals, Trotsky, Bukharin, Zinoviev, look at the role and see something beneath their talents. What they do not see, or do not examine carefully enough, is that the general secretary controls appointments. He decides who gets posted where, which loyal official rises through which committee, which awkward one finds himself transferred to a provincial posting so inconvenient it amounts to exile by bureaucracy. By the time the theoretical battles of the mid-1920s are settled, the men doing the voting are, in significant proportion, men Stalin has placed there. Trotsky is expelled from the party in 1927 and from the Soviet Union 2 years later. Zinoviev and Kamenev, who allied with him too late, recant publicly and are readmitted, then suspect again, then arrested. Bukharin, the party's most admired theorist and Lenin's stated favourite, is outmanoeuvred by 1929 when Stalin simply adopts the industrialization program that Bukharin had spent 2 years opposing, leaving him with no position to defend, no allies still standing, and no mechanism through which opposition could be made to mean anything. The first 5-year plan adopted in 1928 calls for a 250% increase in overall industrial production, a 330% expansion in heavy industry, targets no economy could have reached, set by men who believed that will could override arithmetic. Forced collectivization of agriculture begins simultaneously, stripping peasants of land worked for generations. The result, across Ukraine, Kazakhstan and the northern Caucasus, is famine. Between 1932 and 1933, millions die. The information reaches Moscow. It is filed. The more useful decision for a system that cannot admit the targets were wrong is to find someone responsible for the shortfall, and Soviet political vocabulary acquires a new word for them: wreckers. The factory manager whose output falls short is not failing, he is sabotaging. The agronomist whose harvest estimate was too optimistic is not mistaken, he is an enemy of the people. Every gap between the plan and reality becomes, by definition, evidence of a conspiracy, which means the officials responsible for meeting the targets are already, in principle, suspects. The 17th Party Congress, meeting in January and February 1934, is officially the Congress of Victors. The worst of the collectivization crisis has passed. The first plan has been declared a success. Every delegate rises to applaud. Beneath the surface, something else is being registered. According to testimony that surfaces decades later, a significant number of delegates voted in the internal Congress ballot for Sergei Kirov, head of the Leningrad party apparatus, as General Secretary in preference to Stalin, though the complete ballot records disappeared and no precise count was ever established. What can be established is this: of the 139 Central Committee members elected at that Congress, 98 were arrested within 4 years, and most were shot. Kirov is not a dissident. He has worked alongside Stalin for years, praised him publicly, delivered the correct speeches at the correct moments. He is popular in ways that are difficult to manage, An effective speaker, genuinely liked by party workers in Leningrad, occasionally willing to argue for less harshness in enforcing the collectivization line. By the summer of 1934, the NKVD, the Soviet secret police answerable directly to Stalin, have been quietly filing reports to Moscow on his movements, his contacts, his conversations. Precisely what Stalin thinks of him in the months between the Congress and December is not recorded in any document that has survived. On the 1st of December 1934, a young Communist Party member named Leonid Nikolaev walks into the corridor of the Smolny Institute in Leningrad and shoots Kirov dead. The investigation that follows is removed from the Leningrad NKVD almost immediately and placed in the hands of officers sent directly from Moscow. Nikolaev and 13 alleged co-conspirators are tried within a month and executed. The NKVD officers who had been assigned to protect Kirov are themselves arrested, charged partly with negligence, though recent archival evidence indicates that the protective arrangements around Kirov had been deliberately compromised from above. Stalin arrives by overnight train on the morning of the 2nd of December, takes personal charge of the scene, and interviews the suspect himself. By that point, working through the night, he has already done the most consequential thing. On the evening of the 1st of December, within hours of the shooting, he signed an emergency decree eliminating due process for anyone accused of terrorism. No defense counsel, no right of appeal. Sentences to be carried out immediately upon pronouncement. The decree will remain in force for 20 years. The investigation into Kirov's death will produce in expanding rings first dozens of arrests, then hundreds, then thousands. Each round of confessions implicating new names, each new name requiring a new arrest, the chain of association growing until it reaches every corner of the party that built the Soviet state. The first thing the defendants had to do was confess, not privately, not in a signed statement delivered to a judge in a closed room, but publicly, in open court in front of journalists and foreign diplomats and Soviet citizens selected for the audience, with the full text printed in the newspapers the following morning. The confession was not incidental to the trial. It was the trial. Without it, there was nothing. No physical evidence, no independent witnesses, no documentation of the crimes alleged. What the court required, and what the NKVD spent weeks or months extracting before any defendant appeared in public, was a man standing upright in a dock and saying, in his own voice, that he had done what the state said he had done. Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev had been Lenin's closest collaborators. Zinoviev had run the Communist International, Kamenev had chaired the Moscow Soviet. They were not obscure figures whose destruction could pass unnoticed. They were among the most recognizable names in the revolutionary generation, men whose photographs hung in party offices alongside Lenin's for years. At the first Moscow trial in August 1936, they stood before the court and confessed to organizing a terrorist conspiracy, plotting to murder Stalin and his associates, maintaining secret contact with Leon Trotsky in exile, and bearing moral responsibility for the assassination of Kirov. They had agreed to confess after months of interrogation, with assurances, not kept, that their lives would be spared. On the 24th of August 1936, all 16 defendants were found guilty. Zinoviev and Kamenev were executed within 24 hours. The foreign press struggled to account for what it had witnessed. Some correspondents concluded that the confessions were genuine, that these men, products of a revolutionary culture that placed the party above the individual, had internalized their own guilt at some level that made the performance possible. The New York Times reported the trial as credible. British diplomats in the audience cabled home that the proceedings appeared legally sound. The Soviet government had constructed something that looked, from a certain distance and under certain assumptions, like justice, and the distance and the assumptions were exactly what it was relying on. Within the Soviet Union, the newspapers demanded severe punishment, and the factories passed resolutions of condemnation, the text of which arrived by circular from party offices and required signatures. The second trial in January 1937 brought 17 defendants, including Karl Radek and Yuri Pyatakov, both senior figures in the Soviet economic and political apparatus. The third trial in March 1938 brought 21, among them Nikolai Bukharin, the man Lenin had called the party's most valuable theorist, Alexei Rykov, a former prime minister, and Genrikh Yagoda, the NKVD chief who had supervised the first trial and was now standing in the same dock his victims had occupied. Yagoda's presence was its own statement. The system did not protect you for having served it faithfully. Service was not a shield. It was merely the last stage before suspicion. Bukharin presents the most documented and most painful case. He had spent years watching the logic of the terror unfold, watching men he had known since the revolution stand in that courtroom and confess to things he knew they had not done, understanding what it meant for him, and understanding it with the full analytical precision of a man who had spent his life examining how power works. When he was arrested in February 1937, he entered into a negotiation with the NKVD that lasted months, refusing to confess to everything, insisting on distinguishing between what he would admit and what he would not, writing long letters to Stalin that combined passionate declarations of loyalty with careful legal arguments about the charges against him. He had watched enough confessions to know that the negotiation itself was part of the performance the system required, and he conducted it anyway, because there was nothing else to do. He agreed, finally, to confess to a general political responsibility for opposition, on the understanding that his young wife and infant son would be spared. After his execution in March 1938, his wife was sentenced to 20 years of hard labour. His son was told his father had been a traitor and grew up not knowing the truth. Before his arrest, Bukharin had written a letter addressed to a future generation of party leaders, beginning with the words, "I am leaving life." He asked to be rehabilitated when the inevitable correction came, insisting he was innocent of every specific charge. That he wrote it at all, that his response to a system designed to make truth unspeakable was to find a way to speak it anyway, addressed to people who did not yet exist, is perhaps the most precise measure of what the terror cost the people it consumed. He rolled the pages around a metal rod and gave them to his wife to memorize. She committed them to memory and carried them for 50 years. The letter was finally read to the Soviet public in 1988. What the trials required at the operational level was not only the breaking of individual defendants, but also the construction of an architecture of guilt that could expand indefinitely outward. Each confession named accomplices. Each set of accomplices, once arrested, named further names. By July 1937, this logic had been formalized. Stalin sent a directive to all regional party secretaries ordering them to report, within 5 days, how many kulaks and criminals in their areas should be arrested or shot. The secretaries sent back their numbers. NKVD Order Number 00447, signed 30th of July 1937, turned those numbers into quotas. 2 categories, 2 fates, with specific figures assigned to each region of the country. The quotas were exceeded almost immediately. Regional NKVD bosses, alert to what enthusiasm signalled about loyalty, wired Moscow to request higher numbers. One documented case from Tashkent describes local NKVD officers who had exhausted every obvious suspect in the city and, upon receiving an order to send 200 more prisoners, arrested an entire encampment of Romani men from 17 to 60 years old and charged them with sabotage. The machinery of the terror had passed a certain point at which the original political targets, the party elite, the old Bolsheviks, the military leadership, were a minority of its victims. The largest single operation of the entire period was not the show trials that occupied the international press. It was the mass operations that ran in parallel, and largely in silence. Outside the courtrooms and the NKVD interrogation cells, the terror was restructuring ordinary life in ways that would outlast it by decades. The question every Soviet citizen faced was not whether enemies existed, but whether any distance was safe. From a colleague, from a neighbour, from a member of your own family who had already been taken. People wrote diary entries in deliberately illegible scripts. Conversations fell silent mid-sentence when a third person entered the room. The Soviet press printed pre-written letters of denunciation, pre-written and available in their thousands, through which a child could formally sever all connection to an arrested parent. I renounce my father because for many years he deceived the people. Parents sometimes begged their children to submit these letters to protect them from the stigma of association. Children sometimes submitted them without being asked, understanding what survival required before anyone had explained it to them. There were people who refused. The Georgian poet Paolo brought before a writers' union meeting and required to denounce colleagues, instead produced a hunting rifle and took his own life in the room rather than comply. There were NKVD officers who falsified their records to undercount arrests. There were party members who voted against resolutions of condemnation and were noted for it, and survived nonetheless, though they could not have known they would. Resistance existed. It simply had no mechanism through which it could accumulate into something that could stop the machinery. It expressed itself in gestures, in silences, in the private preservation of a truth that could not be spoken aloud, and for most of the people who made those gestures, the record of them was lost. By late 1937, regional NKVD chiefs were not reporting difficulty finding enemies. They were reporting difficulty processing the numbers they had already found, and wiring Moscow for permission to raise the quotas further still. Mikhail Tukhachevsky was 44 years old in 1937, a marshal of the Soviet Union and the most consequential military thinker the Red Army had produced. In the early 1920s, while most European armies were still digesting the lessons of the Western Front, more artillery, deeper trenches, longer bombardments, Tukhachevsky was writing about something different: the simultaneous attack across the entire depth of an enemy's position, aircraft and armour and infantry moving together in a coordinated strike that would give the defending force no time to respond to any one threat before another had opened behind it. He called it deep operations. He built schools around it, promoted the officers who understood it, and by the mid-1930s had overseen the construction of an armoured force that, on paper, was the largest in the world. The Wehrmacht would develop almost identical concepts in the same years. In June 1941, they would use them against an army that had, in the intervening period, shot most of the people who understood what was coming. Tukhachevsky was arrested on the 22nd of May 1937, 10 days after being removed from his post as Deputy Commissar of Defence. The charge was treason, specifically a conspiracy with Germany to hand over Soviet military secrets and prepare the conditions for a military coup against Stalin. The evidence was fabricated. The confession was extracted under torture so severe that when his interrogation file was recovered decades later, the pages were stained with blood. He was tried in secret on the 11th of June 1937 before a tribunal of fellow officers, several of whom would themselves be arrested within months of signing the verdict and shot the same day. He was 44 years old. What followed over the next 18 months dismantled the command structure of the Soviet armed forces from the top down. 3 of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union were executed. 13 of 15 army commanders were removed and most were shot. 8 of 9 admirals perished. 50 of 57 corps commanders were gone, and 154 of 186 division commanders. The institutional knowledge concentrated in those ranks was not destroyed in battle. It was destroyed in offices, in interrogation rooms, in the basements of NKVD buildings, by the state those officers had spent their careers serving. The officers who replaced them were younger, less experienced, and had learned from watching what happened to their predecessors that the primary professional requirement was not competence, but the appearance of loyalty, 2 qualities that, under the pressure of actual war, would prove to be different things. Recent archival analysis has confirmed what the scale of the purge long suggested. Stalin was not reacting to any genuine conspiracy threat. the quantitative evidence shows he specifically targeted the most competent officers, controlling for rank and party history. The probability of being arrested increased with demonstrated military ability. This was not paranoia operating blindly, it was a preventive calculation. Capable generals are capable of things that loyal mediocrities are not, and Stalin had decided to govern a military staffed by the second category. The practical consequences of that decision would not become visible for 4 years. When they did, they were visible across a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea in the form of armoured columns advancing hundreds of miles in weeks through positions that should have held. The terror reached the army at the same moment it was reaching everywhere else, and the mechanism in the military worked the same way it worked in the factories and party offices and writers' unions. An arrested officer was required to name co-conspirators. The co-conspirators, once arrested, named further names. Officers who had worked together, trained together, argued about doctrine together, found those shared professional associations reframed as evidence of a shared conspiracy. Tukhachevsky's name, once attached to the charge, became a category. Anyone who had served under him, studied his ideas, attended his lectures, corresponded with him on military matters, was potentially implicated. The NKVD did not need to fabricate the connections. The professional relationships were real. What it fabricated was their meaning. The army did not collapse inward in the way the party had. Soldiers in garrisons across the Soviet Union continued to train. Units continued to exist. The institutional form of a military remained intact. What had been removed was the capacity for independent judgment at the senior levels. The officers who might have looked at a tactical situation and disagreed with an order, who had enough standing and experience to push back on a plan they believed would fail. That capacity had been the thing Stalin was eliminating. By the time the German invasion began on the 22nd of June 1941, and the scale of the catastrophe became clear within the first hours, entire armies cut off, air forces destroyed on the ground, commanders unable to reach anyone above them for orders because the communication structure had disintegrated. There was no one in the senior ranks with enough institutional authority or experience to manage what was happening independently, and the officer who showed initiative without orders risked attracting the kind of attention that had already destroyed so many of his predecessors. Back in the cities, the terror that had consumed the party and the military had by 1938 worked its way into the texture of life in ways that were no longer attached to any specific political event. The CHSVN designation, Wives of Enemies of the People, had created a new administrative category of persecuted women, subject to arrests not for anything they had done, but for whom they had been married to. Tens of thousands were sentenced to camps or internal exile, leaving children to be raised by grandparents, or placed in state orphanages where they were given different names and told their parents were dead. The children who were not institutionalized grew up in a specific kind of knowledge, that the wrong information about their families, disclosed at the wrong moment, would close every door available to them. Schools, universities, professional advancement, all filtered through a biographical questionnaire that asked about class origins, party membership, and the status of parents. A father who had disappeared into the camps in 1937 was a fact to be concealed, reworded, omitted. Some children, reaching adulthood, genuinely did not know what had happened to a parent who had vanished when they were 3 years old, the family having collectively decided that not knowing was safer than knowing. On the 17th of November 1938, a joint directive signed by Stalin halted the mass operations of the NKVD. The formal reason given was the restoration of proper legal procedures and the correction of excesses. Nikolai Yezhov, who had run the NKVD through the worst 2 years and signed the orders that sent hundreds of thousands of people to their deaths, was removed from his post in December 1938. He was arrested in April 1939, tried in secret, and executed in February 1940, having repeatedly told the court that he had been a loyal Bolshevik his entire life. He was 45 years old. His successor as NKVD chief, Lavrenti Beria, oversaw a brief period in which some of the most obviously baseless cases were reviewed and a small number of those arrested were released. Enough to signal that the frenzy was over, not enough to constitute any reckoning with what had happened. The camps continued to fill. The labour of their prisoners continued to drive the extraction industries of the far north and east. What had changed were the pace and the visibility, not the structure. And the structure would hold, through the war and its aftermath and the last convulsions of Stalin's rule, until the morning of the 2nd of March 1953, when it encountered the one thing it had not been designed to outlast. Stalin died on the 5th of March 1953. The circumstances were, in their way, appropriate to the system he had built. He had suffered a stroke on the night of the 1st of March, collapsing on the floor of his dacha at Kuntsevo outside Moscow. His bodyguards, trained by 20 years of institutional terror not to enter his rooms without being summoned, did not find him until the following morning. The members of the Politburo who were called to the dacha, Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev, Bulganin, arrived and stood around a dying man on a sofa, understanding that their own survival might depend on what each of the others decided to do in the next several hours. No one called a doctor immediately. They watched. He died 4 days later without regaining consciousness, and the men who had spent years terrified of him now had to decide very quickly what to do with what he had left behind. What he had left behind was not only a system of government, but also a society that had been restructured at every level around the assumption that trust was dangerous. The Gulag at the moment of his death held somewhere between 2 and 2.5 million prisoners, a number that had fluctuated across the preceding 2 decades as arrest operations expanded and contracted, as labour demands shifted between sectors, as the war had briefly altered the calculations. Behind that number were the families of every person in those camps, the wives under CHSVN designations, the children with spoilt biographies, the colleagues who had signed the denunciation papers or the resolutions of condemnation, and now had to continue working alongside the families of the people they had condemned. The apparatus did not require Stalin to keep running, which was the first problem his successors faced. Beria, who understood it better than anyone, moved immediately to release a small number of high-profile prisoners and signal that the worst was over, as a way of consolidating his own position before the others could consolidate theirs. He was arrested in June 1953 and executed in December, the last senior figure of the terror to die by the same mechanism he had operated. What the Soviet Union could not do, and what no single speech was ever going to resolve, became clear on the 25th of February 1956. Nikita Khrushchev took the podium at the 20th Party Congress in Moscow in a closed session from which journalists and foreign delegations had been excluded. He delivered a speech that lasted nearly 4 hours. He told the assembled delegates that Stalin had used torture to extract confessions, that Stalin had personally signed 383 execution lists in 1937 and 1938 containing the names of thousands of people, that 70% of the Central Committee members elected at the 17th Congress, the Congress of Victors, the Congress whose delegates had gathered 22 years earlier to applaud a man who was already planning most of their deaths, had been arrested and shot. That the military purge had directly contributed to the catastrophic losses of the first months of the German invasion, that the confessions at the show trials were fabricated, that the system had operated not in spite of the party but through it, with the party's full institutional participation at every level. Some delegates fainted, others sat in complete silence. The speech had been authorized after a party commission spent weeks reviewing the evidence in the Soviet archives, and the evidence was not ambiguous. The execution lists with Stalin's signature, the NKVD operational orders with their regional quotas, the interrogation files with their physical evidence of what had been done to the people who signed the confessions. Khrushchev read from them. The room understood that everyone in it had lived inside a system whose mechanics were being described from the podium, and that most of them had participated in those mechanics in one way or another, by voting for resolutions, by signing forms, by staying silent at moments when silence was the only rational choice. The speech was never officially published in the Soviet Union, Copies were sent to regional party offices to be read aloud at meetings, which meant that within weeks, millions of Soviet citizens had heard its contents through the party infrastructure that had enabled the terror in the first place. The CIA obtained a copy through Israeli intelligence within 2 months and published it in full. What Khrushchev had done was acknowledge inside the system that the system had committed crimes, while carefully constructing the acknowledgement so that the system itself bore no institutional responsibility. The crimes were Stalin's. The party was his victim. The Politburo members who had signed the orders alongside him, who had exceeded their quotas and written congratulatory reports to Moscow about enemies uncovered and sentences fulfilled, they were not mentioned by name, and Khrushchev did not mention his own considerable role in the terrorist operations in Ukraine during the worst years. The speech was a reckoning designed to leave the institution that needed to be reckoned with intact. The years that followed, the Khrushchev thaw, the cautious reopening of cultural life, the release of survivors from the camps, had a specific texture that is difficult to describe to anyone who did not live inside it. People who had been in the Gulag for 15 or 20 years came back to cities that had continued without them, to families that had reorganized themselves around their absence, to colleagues who had signed the papers. The state issued rehabilitation certificates, official documentation that the person named had been falsely convicted and was now cleared. Recipients kept these documents in drawers. Some showed them to no one. A rehabilitation certificate returned a name to legal standing. It did not return the years, or the people who had not survived to receive one, or the explanation owed to children who had grown up being told their parents were traitors. What it could not do, what no document could do, was answer the question that the terror had distributed across an entire society, not what had been done to people, but what people had done to each other, and whether that could be acknowledged without the acknowledgement consuming everything. The question did not get answered under Khrushchev, who was removed from power in a party coup in 1964. It did not get answered under Brezhnev, who partially rehabilitated Stalin's reputation and encouraged a selective memory that preserved the wartime leadership while suffering the memory of the purges. It did not get answered under Gorbachev, though the opening of archives and the brief extraordinary flourishing of Memorial, the organization dedicated to documenting the victims, came closer than anything before it. Memorial was eventually declared a foreign agent and dissolved by Russian courts in 2021 and 2022, its archive of 300,000 personal testimonies from Gulag survivors dispersed. Polling conducted in recent years consistently shows a significant portion of the Russian population views Stalin favorably, most commonly as the leader who industrialized the country and won the war. The achievements visible, the mechanism through which they were pursued available to anyone who looks, but looked at by fewer people each decade as the generation that lived inside it dies. The terror that Stalin built required at every stage the participation of people who were not Stalin. It required the NKVD officer who understood the quota he had been given and found names to fill it. It required the party secretary who voted for the resolution and did not ask what happened next. It required the neighbour who filled the denunciation, the colleague who did not speak up at the meeting, the judge who signed the sentence in 20 minutes because 20 minutes was what the schedule allowed. It required, in the deepest sense, the construction of a world in which all of those actions were rational, in which the cost of not doing them was higher than the cost of doing them, and the cost of looking directly at what they added up to was higher than both. A state does not need to force its citizens to destroy each other. It needs only to arrange the conditions under which destruction becomes the safest available choice. What Stalin built required, at every level, the participation of people who were not Stalin, and the most honest question his system leaves behind is not what he did to his citizens, but what he required them to do to each other. If you enjoyed this video, you may also like our video on Europe's first dictator, Mussolini, and the birth of fascism. Please like and subscribe, and let us know in the comments which chapter we should cover next.